1929. The financial house of cards collapses, and the overinflated stock market plunges into a Great Depression. A financial panic grips the world. For the majority, it means the interminable line outside factory gates, desperately hoping for a job that rarely comes. It means hunger and a march of the unemployed in the nation's capital. With acute domestic problems, America would now isolate herself more than ever from the international scene. It started in America, but practically overnight an economic blizzard swept the world. In Japan, France, Britain, always the unemployed, the soup kitchens, the grinding poverty, and the despair.
That you find here you borrow, you cannot keep it long, it seems. But gigolo and gigolette still sing a song and dance along the boulevard of broken dreams.
Everyone who lived through the Great Depression has a story to tell. Stay with us as ordinary people recall extraordinary times in Pennsylvania.
By the summer of 1932, things were at their worst. And this was the president of the First National Bank actually thought the bank were going to fail. And he was lamenting that fact in correspondence. Even the bank couldn't pay its bills. The Bellefonte Trust Company, which is now Mid-State Bank, their employees were down in the cellar in the evenings taking target practice with actual weapons. They were afraid there was going to be a run on the bank or mass civil disturbance.
Pennsylvania felt the impact of the Great Depression unevenly. Cities dependent on trade and industry were devastated. Rural areas fared better, at least there people could eat. But no town or hamlet escaped, and ultimately no person was left untouched.
I would say I noticed it first in 1931. I came back from Pittsburgh and went to work in Dad's grocery store. And by then, people were beginning to hurt because we had back at that time what they called overseers of the poor. And Bellefonte Borough had one. And we used to get food slips allowing these people to purchase a certain amount in dollars, and then the borough would take care of it later on.
Between 1930 and 1933, 9,000 American banks closed. Depositors lost $2.5 billion.
Well, as a child, I had some doting grandparents that would give me $1 every now and then, and I had a bank, and we weren't allowed to spend that money. We had to put it in a bank. And, I don't recall now how much money I might have had, maybe $350. But I entered college in 1930, right around the time when everything was so bad and banks were closing, and I lost all my childhood savings.
Business failures and unemployment spread. Those lucky enough to keep their jobs often found their hours and wages cut. For others, there simply were no jobs to be had.
When the Depression hit, of course, everything slacked off. And I remember that we worked 3 and 4 days a week for quite a while.
I was working for the Bell Telephone of Pennsylvania, which is no more. And of course, it was a 40-hour week, and they had more or less contracted that they would not have any layoffs. They tried their very best to avoid it. But instead of that, for a while, they cut down to a 36-hour week, and then later on a 32-hour week, which of course affected the paycheck that much.
I remember my husband, he was just my beau at the time. came to where I lived on State Street, the Doctor Zimmerman's, and he said he was going to Philadelphia, see if he could get a freighter out for some work. And I said, no, you better not go. And he said, well, I have to go. There's no work around here. So I offered him money to go, and he said, no. He said, I've got a few cents on me. And he hitchhiked to Philadelphia, and he was there for about a week. And there was he couldn't get a boat out. They weren't hiring. And he came back, he still had 2 cents. And I said, well, how did you do it? He said, well, people were good. They had kitchens. You got some soup. He said, it wasn't like Mother would make it home, but he said, I lived on it.
Pennsylvanians adjusted to the hard times as best they could. Thrown back on their own resources, they tightened their belts and found ways to cope.
Many families moved together at the time of the Depression, especially young married couples who had just started their own homes, had to give up their homes and move in with their families.
One thing I can remember that we had 5 children in my family. I was the 4th or 5th, and we never were allowed to eat a full banana. I was probably 30 or 35 years old before I would eat a whole banana. We would eat half a banana, and you always left some for your brothers and sisters.
I remember a party giving us a ham bone, and some of my neighbors, maybe they had a few beans or something. Well, we'd put this stuff together, and the 2 or 3 families would eat. We would have a meal.
And during that time, we canned all of our own meat and fruit and vegetables. We had a 3-burner kerosene stove that we canned on. And my husband and his uncle went up in the mountain and trailed down logs and sawed up so for 3 years it didn't cost us anything for our fuel, which was a great help.
Well, everything was self-sufficient. They didn't have food stamp programs in those days, so what they did was give people burpees seeds. And we gave half of the backyard was turned into a garden, and people who had no land would come here and plant a garden, and in that way they got half of the food which they raised, and they gave us the other half for providing the land.
Churches helped. YMCAs and people of that sort, Salvation Army.
Salvation Army was one.
Helped with food and things of that sort.
You had what you had, and you had it, you had it, and if you didn't, you did without it.
Guido Valentino was a teenager in Altoona. Until the Depression hit, he had planned to work for the railroad.
That was everybody's ambition, to get in the railroad. But needless and sad to say, I never got to that railroad till 1939.
Instead of working the rails, Guido rode them, joining thousands of young men crisscrossing the country in search of work.
We rode the passenger trains. Now, passenger trains, not too many hobos really became too good at it, because you had to be athletic, you had to be strong, because you had to catch them on the move pulling out of a station. And the station, there was always railroad bulls around. Well, you got caught, they'd take you down to the local jail and keep you for, I've been in many jails across the country, because I've been in, at that time it was only 48 states, we made all of them.
Someone asked a noted economist in the early 30s if any historical era compared with the Great Depression. Yes, he replied, the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years. By 1932, people were desperate for change. Pennsylvania voted for Herbert Hoover that year, but the revolution put in place by Franklin Roosevelt made the Democratic Party a viable presence in the state for the first time in generations. 4 years later, Pennsylvania joined the Roosevelt landslide.
Well, everybody expected a change. They really did. That's what they voted for, was a change, and that's what they got. They got plenty of it.
What do I think about Roosevelt? Well, I guess I thought a lot of him in those days, and I think I still do. I know My parents were died in the old Republicans, and I voted. He was the first president I ever voted for, and I voted for him as a registered Republican. So that my dad didn't like very well.
Well, Roosevelt was different. There was just no doubt about it. And people were in such financial and physical conditions back at that time that they were willing to try most anything.
There was hope then. I know I had young brothers, and they found work, you know, in these camps and things like that, that otherwise was try to find something to eat.
I remember that very vaguely of President Hoover, who everyone seemed to think was a good man, but more or less ineffectual. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took over and said, "My friends," that it sort of inspired people to take new hope in life, right. And that they all pulled together and with help of everybody trying and the help of the good Lord, the Franklin Roosevelt was the inspiration to pull out of the Depression, in my opinion.
And I was born in Rockford, Michigan.
My name is Bernie DiPrimo. I'll be 86 in June.
I'm Jack Bates. John Mulhook.
Doris Gordon.
Wilma Oley.
My name is Delbert Keith Gordon. Uncle Sam calls me Delbert. My friends call me Keith. You know, the Depression was perhaps different for the farmers because we had everything. There was not much. I do remember in the Depression that we didn't have certain things. There was all of a sudden, everybody went to town on Saturday night, took their eggs into the grocery store and so on, and everybody was in town on Saturday night. That was just the way things were done. And I was given a dime that I could spend. Well, a dime would buy you one of these big Hershey bars, and or spend 5 cents for an ice cream cone. And suddenly, my mother told me, "Well, you're only going to get a nickel." And then after a while, she said, "We can't give you anything."
I would think that in those days, the family life was better than it is today. Well, the families were closer together in those days. They had to depend on each other, and they paid more attention to each other. Now, the family, for example, my family, I have 3 sons. Only one of them lives in the city. The other 2 live out of the city, and while we have a very good connection, we're not as close as our family was back when I was a child.
As far as I can remember, I just remember my mother talking about we belonged to the Clean Your Plate Club and had to eat, always had to, and I think I may have been a kind of an early age, kind of a picky eater, because I think I wasn't always wanting to eat, but my mother said, "Well, we belong to the Clean Your Plate Club, so we have to clean your plate." So it's very hard for me to leave food because that was so ingrained in me. But I don't remember that our diet was lacking in anything at that time. I think we had everything that we needed, as far as I can remember.
I was fortunate to have a father that was very generous, mother, and were remarkable parents. My father, being a dentist in a small town, was respected, and during a depression, he had days when he didn't have patients, but his income was sufficient to keep us in what I would say luxury. The farmers had no money during a depression, so the only way they could get dental care, and they were glad to do it, was to pay him with the produce that they could make. And we lived high on the hog with lots of chickens, ducks, and geese. And Father loved to split wood, and we heated with wood in the kitchen.
and he split wood, so they'd bring in wood that they had cut from their woods. And he enjoyed the splitting, and it was little Willie's job. I had to keep the wood box filled. That was my only occupation outside of mowing lawn. But I remember that if I didn't fill that wood box at night, my mother would have to go out to the woodshed to get the wood. He was very unhappy and had no hesitation to kind of talk to young Willie about not keeping up with his responsibility.
Another thing, we had a furnace, but we had to turn all the heat off to all the bedrooms, and it would just come in the living room. And we just had one register, and how we had to take turns on that register getting dressed in the morning. Sometime my brother would boot me off the register because it was his turn to be on the register, because that was a good place to stay warm and get dressed. But we had to give up the heat in the other parts of the house. The kitchen and the living room were the only place, but no heat in the bedrooms at all to save.
If we got a cold, Mother would put a plaster of antiphlogistin, sort of a paste, on our chest, and then put a warm cloth over that. And that was supposed to help us when we had a cold, to keep our chest clear. And Father had been brought up, if we had had a bad cold, that if he used just sulfur and blew it in our mouth, the sulfur would get into our throat and eventually into our lungs, and that would help us to get rid of a cold. I don't think they do that anymore, but I remember having it done.
My mother had one remedy, and I've always loved cinnamon ever since. It was cinnamon patch she used to put on her chest instead of, I know they had mustard patches, she never used those, but that cinnamon patch was great for colds and for breathing, and helping to breathe and so on. That was very good, yeah.
We just cod liver oil and stuff like that was supposed to keep us going. Plus, again, being a Christian family, we heard all the time that the Lord will take care of us and the Lord will provide. And so we didn't have a lot of health problems. I don't remember anything serious.
Well, my dad was a great one for home remedies. He always had an ailment of one kind or another. He wasn't happy unless he had an ailment or two. And so he used everything from Indian herb medicines to Chinese acupuncture.
You didn't call the doctor. I used to have a lot of ear trouble. You didn't go to the doctor unless you absolutely were practically on your deathbed. But she always had home remedies. They always used the mentholated salve for when you had a sore throat, and then it was always a salve of some kind. But I remember the McNiss man. There was a man that used to sell medication, and it was called the McNiss man. And he'd bring around this mentholated salve, and she'd buy that from him. But we always liked to see him come, because after he sold all this medication to her, he always gave us a stick of gum. One stick of gum, that's what we got, and we look forward to that.
Just don't emphasize stuff. Don't emphasize keeping up with the Joneses, if you will, and having to have every little gadget, every new thing that comes out. But just be yourself, and don't try to live up to what other people think. I guess that's the thing.
And I'm always amazed these days at how some of these people that are having such hard time financially, but they've got everything. Everything new that comes out, they've got it, And we got along without those things because they weren't available. But I don't think you need to have everything that there is to be happy. Some things I think it's a lot of things that make people, and they're not really happy anyway.
The Depression, as I say, it didn't affect us as it did a lot of people who were out of work and who had to depend on others to feed them or help them out and various things like that. We were pretty much, I know my dad lent money to people from time to time because he had it.
I can't find myself being bitter about the Depression. I thought there was something close. Not that I would wish everybody to go through it, but I don't remember us kids ever giving my parents a bad time and wish we could have done this or that. We were content.
I was born in 1918, which would make me 11 then, in 1929 when the Depression started. And my dad pitched a tent there, built a deck, so a foot and a half off the ground. And I think the tent must have been at least 12 by 14, 12 by 16. It was a big thing because our whole family lived in it, while my two uncles and my grandmother were living over in a two-car garage type building with a shed on the front of it for the kitchen. And so we lived in that tent. I don't remember how many years, but quite a while. And my little sister was born there, and so for a while there was the four of us, and then she was born, there was the five of us living in that tent. I didn't know we were poor. I knew we were living in a tent and other kids didn't, that sort of stuff. But that's the way life was, you know, and as long as we ate, and Mom made clothes and repaired clothes and that sort of stuff, and that's just the way it was. And you didn't really stop to think about, gosh, this is tough. Not as kids. Now, I know my mom and dad did, but I didn't as a kid.
We were poor. There were 7 of us, 7 children, and I was next to the last. And Mother was a great seamstress, and she made 4 girls, made all our clothes. And I remember this fellow was saying we had flour sack clothing, underclothing, and Mother made those flour sack nightgowns, but ours weren't flowered. They were just the plain white flour sack nightgowns with colored, what do you call it, bias tape around here to give a little color to the nightgowns. But they were nicely made, and I wore those till I went to college. Mother was a good cook.
You had a big garden too.
A huge garden, and we all had to be part of the preserving the garden and canning and everything all summer, planting and coming home from school. A favorite thing was to go to the garden and pull up a carrot and go wash it in the cow's barrel where she got her water to drink, and chomping down on that big carrot. That was just heaven. That was wonderful. I can see that big, long, great, nicely shaped, because I had weeded the carrots so they were nice shaped, you know. But we were all a part of that whole garden, and I can see which rows were the beets, and it was all a part of our living. We didn't go play, we did the garden. And I would pick raspberries and take them down to the little corner grocery store, so he would give me 5 cents for this little cup of raspberries. So that was my first money I earned. I mean, that was big money. We had pigs. We had a big old sow she was prolific. She had 22 little piglets. So there was too many faucets she didn't have enough faucets, so we had to take care of the little pigs, and we'd raise those pigs and sell them so we could go to college. I mean, that's the way we got along. We sold the pigs to go to college.
That was 1938.
That was after the Depression.
Hmm?
That was after the Depression.
Yeah, not in Wenatchee, it wasn't. It was real late getting here, Bob. We got the brunt of it late, 5 or 6 years. I was looking for work, of course, and I applied at 63 different places. I kept a record on a notebook, And some of those places I had checked 3 different times. I went to 3 different times at 63 places. And there's just no job. And when I tell you about what the Daily World collections were like, there's no money. And so finally I had some training and I wanted to get some experience, and I said, well, I'll work for nothing. And because I want some experience, if nothing else. And they couldn't believe it, but they took me on at $40 a month, which I didn't, they took me on for nothing. At the end of the month, I got a check for $40. And I just couldn't believe it. But they had, I guess I was worth $40 a month to them. So anyway, they paid me $40 that month, and the next month, and the next month. So that was my first job.
By the time I graduated, there wasn't any banks. So I went to work for Goodfellow Brothers, taking care of their kids for 10 cents an hour. A lot of money at that time. And then in the fall of '35, after my second child was born, we lived in Cashmere. The fruit all froze in the fields. There was no apple. Packing sheds open that was a rough winter.
Today's people don't know how to make do. They don't even know what it means to make do. And we made do with whatever we had. If you don't have what you want, you take what you've got and make something out of it. Whether it's taking a coat, turning it wrong side out, and making another coat out of the inside of the fabric, which we did.
We seem to be so wasteful nowadays, and they don't need to be wasteful. Be frugal. You can get along with so much less than you go to the store without a list and just buy stuff. And if you go with a list, that's what you walk out the store, you've got everything you needed, and that's it. You don't
Get rid
have
of
to.
credit cards.
Yes.
And that one term answers a lot of this greed that's taken place at the top of the business hierarchy in this country. Instant gratification. They want it now, and they want it immediately, they want all of it. And it's not possible, and of course that's going to create a real dislocation when it actually hits.